All right, well, shall we begin with a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we lift up Vicky and her current situation in the family. Pray for everyone that is interacting on these Zoom meetings that are having their own personal crises, whether it's health, finances, or whatever. We ask that your will be accomplished in all those areas, and for those around the world that are presenting this message, trying to understand this message, we ask that you would bless them as well. And we need your Holy Spirit as we study today. And we ask for that. And we thank you for these things. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to read through Panium number 21, which has been posted now. But as I read through it here just a while ago, there was a couple typos. Isn't going to impact what we're doing here, but it isn't fully finished, even though it's been posted. After we read through this, and then I have a series of slides, and the series of slides kind of illustrates my personal dilemma. This message is now so big that it's very difficult to get focused in, and I'm going to try to use the slides to do that. I don't mind running down the prophetic line that is opening up full speed ahead if I can run that fast. But I sense that not everyone is keeping up. So I'm kind of forced to try to slow down a little bit and go faster, which I can't do. So we're going to start with this article, and then we'll discuss some of these new pieces of information and some illustrations that follow. Panium number 21. The history from verse 16 to 22 in Daniel 11 begins and ends with the typification of the Sunday law. The lines beginning and ending being the same identifies the signature of Christ as the Alpha and Omega. Prophetically, it requires that verse 16 be aligned with verse 22. When this is done, it moves the history of the glorious land, as represented by the line of the Maccabees, into the history of verses 10 through 15. Verse 16, and I'm commenting now. Verse 16 is when Rome conquered the glorious land, and it typifies the Sunday law. But verse 22 is the crucifixion of Christ, which typifies the Sunday law. So you have Alpha and Omega Sunday law illustration in those verses 16 through 22. And you have to settle into these concepts in order to move further down the prophetic testing process. And early on, after the message was unsealed, beginning at January 1st, 2024, December 31st, 2023, wherever you want to start it, we spent time pointing out that the testing process for the virgins is a prophetic test, a test that requires understanding the methodology that's been opened up by the line of the tribe of Judah and applying it. And recently, Clayton read some books by William Perkins, who I'm sure that all of you know who William Perkins is, even though I didn't until my son Clayton explained it to me. But he lived in I guess it'd be the 16th century, the 1500s. I guess you'd call him a theologian. Maybe that would be offensive to him, but he wrote on Bible subjects. And Clayton was so overwhelmed with how he has a book on prophetic application on two things: how closely the book aligned with William Miller's rules, but also how the book specifically addressed concepts that we've been handling here recently about inclusive and exclusive numbering. He dealt with the same verses that we dealt with. Several things, but as you look at it, you realize that he was in the history when whether you understood this or not, leading up to the production of the King James Bible in 1611, there's a controversy, discussion, debate, whatever it was going on about which books would be included in the Bible that is the true Bible. And ultimately, the true Bible is the King James Version with 66 books. And before 1611, in the middle of the 1500s, this Perkins is writing and arguing that there's 66 books in the Bible, and he goes through and he shows why all the Apocrypha shouldn't be in the Bible. And the point is this: when you see the work that he did in these books, particularly on prophecy, and then you line them up with William Miller's rules, you see that he was a link in the chain that led to the 1611 King James Bible, and then Miller's rules expanded on what he had put in place, even though I have no belief William Miller ever read anything of his. I don't know that. But God providentially watched these things, and he brought it down to this history. This is my point. In this history, the test is over prophecy, and there are certain things now that are being brought into the prophetic focus that are testing. You're going to need to believe that it is so based upon a confidence in the methodology that you're applying. And as you read through this, I hope you have easy access to read through this with me. These numbers 22, 23, 11, they're not accidental, they're purposeful. So if you move verse 22, the cross, back to verse 16, Pompey conquering Jerusalem and Judea, two verses that are Sunday laws, then you have to bring the Maccabean revolt back before verse 16 because it preceded verse 22. Okay, so that's where we're going with this. The Maccabees revolt represents the 22 years that began in 1776 and ended when the United States became the sixth kingdom of Bible prophecy in 1798. This identifies the number 22 as a history directly attached to the time of the end in 1798, which is where verse 40 of Daniel 11 begins. The relation of the number 22 with 1798 is important to identify. The Maccabean revolt, in typifying the American Revolution, aligns both revolutions of the glorious land, literal and spiritual, as revolutions that rejected the statecraft of the Seleucids and the European kings, as well as the churchcraft of Greece and Rome. In both historical testimonies, Greece and Rome represented the king of the north. The line of the Maccabees is represented in verse 23, but it represents a history that began 33 years after Paneum of verse 15 and just over 100 years before Pompey in verse 16. The line ends at the judgment of the cross, a judgment that extended into 70 AD, though that period of judgment is identified as simply the cross in verse 22. Prophetically, the Maccabean line representing the glorious land from 1776, then 1798 with the Hasmonean dynasty, and then the Herodian dynasty to the cross in 70 AD ends at verse 22, and it begins with 22 years from 1776 into 1798. 22 years from 1776 to 1798 also typified the 22 years from 9/11 into 2023, which was typified by the 22 days in Daniel 10. The Maccabean line begins and ends with 22. 4 Roman rulers. Verse 16 through 22 directly identify 4 Roman rulers and represent another line within the verses. The Maccabean line is a line based upon the principle of repeat and enlarge, and the Roman line is directly represented in the verses. Pompey conquered the first of First two of three obstacles as Rome ascended to the throne as the fourth kingdom of Bible prophecy at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. He was followed by, Pompey was followed by Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and Tiberius Caesar. Pompey was a general, and the last three symbols are tied together as emperors. The last of the four rulers dies in verse 22, where Christ was crucified, so we must take the last of the four rulers of Rome back to the Sunday law of verse 16. When we do this, Pompey would represent the first of four waymarks, where the fourth and final waymark aligns with the Sunday law of verse 16. Verse 16 would be represented by Tiberius Caesar, and the Battle of Pippenger of verse 15 would be represented by Augustus Caesar. The Battle of Raphia in verse 11 would be Julius Caesar, thus marking General Pompey as verse 10 in 1989. This identifies that the hidden history of verse 40 of Daniel 11, the history from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 unto the Sunday law of verse 40, is represented by three lines of prophecy that are found in the history represented by verses 10 through 23. The Maccabees, the Roman rulers, and the three battles of Rome's proxy powers. This is the third time I'm coming to you. In the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every word be established. 2 Corinthians 13:1. Three proxy wars. Verse 10 marks the end of the Fourth Syrian War that occurred from 219 until 217 BC, when Antiochus Magnus the Great regrouped in advance of the Battle of verse 11, which was the Battle of Raphia that would be represented by Julius Caesar. Verse 10 identifies the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 as represented in verse 40, and Pompey aligns with this history. Verse 16 represents the conquering of the glorious land of Judah, typifying the Sunday law in the United States, but Pompey also aligns with 1989. And in 1989, modern Rome conquered her first obstacle, but in doing so, she simultaneously spiritually conquered Protestant America when she seduced Ronald Reagan into forming a secret alliance with the glorious land. An alliance with the whore of Rome by a king represents spiritual fornication. 1989 was where the whore of Rome begins to come out of her 70 years to commit fornication with all the kings of the earth. The first king is the United States in 1989, for the United States is also represented by Ahab, who was married to Jezebel, who is the whore of Tyre, in Isaiah 23. And it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years according to the days of one king. After the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as a harlot. Take a harp, go about the city, thou harlot that has been forgotten. Make sweet melody, sing many songs, that thou mayest be remembered. And it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and shall turn her to her hire, and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. Isaiah 23:15 through 17. The whore was forgotten at the time of the end in 1798, when she received her deadly wound, as represented in verse 40 of Daniel 11. At the time of the end in 1989, she begins the period of the healing of her deadly wound by committing fornication with the kingdom, who will be the first to enforce the mark of her authority. And I lost my place. It's about the first of where did I get out? What happened to that? Okay. Um, I'm going to cut it in the middle of that paragraph. I wanted to cut one word, one letter off, and I lost something. I don't even, can't find my place. The symbolic history of the period of 70 years, the days of one king, represent the 70 years that Babylon ruled as the first kingdom of Bible prophecy, and thus typifies the history of the United States from 1798 into the Sunday Law, where the external line of American history is represented by the Republican horn, and the internal line is represented by the Protestant horn. I'm going to try something. Oh, it was down there. Okay. Those two horns representing the heart of the Constitution that provides for a separation of church and statecraft and churchcraft and is the subject of the future of America. Okay. By getting lost in the paragraph, mess that up. I want to make sure you understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in Revelation 13:11, the beast is the government. It's the constitutional government of the United States. That's the beast. And the two horns are republicanism and Protestantism. And and she thinks it was the previous paragraph. I see that. Yeah, I'm going to go back up to the previous paragraph. But in any case, and try to correct everything, the beast is the political structure that is created by the Constitution. And the strength of the Constitution is the separation of church and state. And it is separated on that beast by two horns. They're distinctly separated. Okay, so the beast is the story of the Constitution that establishes the glorious land that gets overturned at the Sunday Law, and the horns of republicanism and Protestantism are what the Constitution is supposed to keep separate. Okay, it's right here where I got lost in this paragraph. I wanted to change enforced to enforce. So the whore was forgotten at the time of the end in 1798 when she received her deadly wound, as represented in verse 40 of Daniel 11. At the time of the end in 1989, she begins the period of the healing of her deadly wound by committing fornication with the kingdom, who will be the first to enforce the mark of her authority. That kingdom was represented by Ahab and by France, who the first time the papacy was placed on the throne of the earth in 538 was the premier kingdom to support the rise of the papal power. For this reason, they are, France, titled as the firstborn of the Catholic Church, as well as the eldest daughter of the Catholic Church. France and Ahab both witness to the United States role from 1989 unto the Sunday Law. Isaiah 23, the whore of Tyre. In Isaiah 23, the whore of Tyre, who is also the whore of Revelation 17, whose forehead has Babylon the Great written upon it, is forgotten for the history of the United States beginning in 1798, when the papacy ceased to be the fifth kingdom of Bible prophecy, the sea beast of Revelation 13. And the United States began its role as the sixth kingdom of Bible prophecy, as the earth beast of Revelation 13, and ultimately as the premier king of the 10 kings of Revelation 17. The symbolic history of a period of 70 years, the days of one king, represents the 70 years that Babylon ruled as the first kingdom of Bible prophecy, and thus typifies the history of the United States from 1798 into the Sunday Law, where the external line of American history is represented by the Republican horn and the internal line is represented by the Protestant horn. Those two horns representing the heart of the Constitution that provides for a separation of statecraft and churchcraft, and is the subject of the future of America. 70 years are marked for the whore of Tyre to be forgotten. Then, from the time of the end of 1989 into the Sunday Law, she begins to sing. She began with a secret alliance as she captured the religion of Protestant America and brought down the political structure of the King of the South with the collapse of the Soviet Union. A period of 70 years that concludes in the history where Antiochus the Great is standing in the middle of a 17-year period that is divided into 10 and 7, which when multiplied equals 70. At the beginning of the external 250 years that ended between Raphia and Penium, the internal time prophecy of 2300 years begins with 70 weeks being determined upon Daniel's people. 457 begins two time prophecies, the one everyone knows, the 2300 years, and the one everyone doesn't know, the 250 years. But they both begin at the same point in 457, and one of them is an internal line about Christ's work of combining divinity with humanity. The other is the external line that deals with the nation that his chosen people are in when the judgment comes to a conclusion at the end of time. So the one begins in 457 and goes to 1844, but 1844 typifies the Sunday law. So the one, the internal one, it goes from 457 BC to 1844, door closed on the parable of the 10 virgins, and then all the way up to the Sunday law, door closed on the parable of the 10 virgins. It's an internal line. The 250 years from that same point in time extends to right in the middle of the Battle of Raphia and Panium. And it's speaking about the Republican horn, if you will, and the 2300s speaking about the Protestant horn. Okay, and at the beginning of the time prophecy, the internal one for God's people, the 2300 years, it begins with 70 weeks that are cut off. They're determined. 70 weeks representing probationary time. So when you see that 70 weeks at the beginning, and then you see at the beginning 250 years takes you to the middle of Raphia and Panium, and it's the middle that creates a period of 10 years followed by 70 years. My argument that 7 times 10 is 70 is an agreement with the 70 weeks at the beginning of the internal line, and at the ending of the external line, you can see a 70. That seems minor, and if that's the only place you saw those, no, I don't. I mean the 2300, not, I don't know why you would think the 2520. I mean the 2300. The prophecy that begins in 457 is the 2300-year prophecy. The other prophecy that begins in 457 is a 250-year prophecy. The one, the 2300, is internal. The 250 is external. The one ends at the Sunday law. Although it was fulfilled on October 22nd, 1844, first, it ends at the Sunday law. And the 250 years ends with Antiochus the Great between Raphia and Panium. And that is the Republican horn of the United States coming to the end of its probationary time between a 10 and a 7, whereas the Protestant horn comes to its conclusion at the end of the 2300-year prophecy that typifies the Sunday law. So, moving on, I find that I tried to read the conversations that's going on in the chats, and they kind of get you off target a little bit. My apologies. And I don't care if you have a conversation. I'm just telling you why I'm kind of being klutzy right here. At the end of those 70 weeks in AD 34, ancient Israel was forever divorced from God as his chosen covenant people, and God had then entered into marriage with his Christian bride and was then reaching out to the Gentiles. 207 BC, Antiochus is standing in the middle of 70, identifying the close of his kingdom's favored nation status as the glorious land. Yes. Did someone say something? No? kingdom's favored nation status as the glorious land where he chose to raise up modern Israel. The end of the United States is the sixth kingdom at the Sunday law is the end of Isaiah's 70 years. The 250-year line of Antiochus is identifying the close of probation for the Republican horn of the United States just before the Sunday law, verse 16. The 2300 years that ended when judgment began on October 22nd, 1844, typifies when judgment closes at the Sunday law. The 2300 years begins with the 70 years that identify the end of literal Israel as God's chosen people, and the end of the overall period of 2300 years concludes with the Protestant movement ending as the Advent movement carried on unto the Sunday law when the closed door of 1844 is repeated with the closed door upon the Republican horn, the Protestant horn, and the government, which is the
Yeah,
beast that has two horns, all come to the end of their probationary time. Yes, someone's
I
talking to
just
me.
I was just wondering if, like you said up earlier, that it was 70 weeks, and here you're saying the 2300 years begins with the 70 years that identifies the end of literal Israel. How do you connect that?
How do I connect what? What I'm saying is that
Well,
two time prophecies begin in 457. I'm saying one of them is internal and one is external.
I understand.
Okay, and then
All
the
I'm saying is,
go ahead.
uh, all I'm saying is that the 2300 years begins with 70 weeks, not 70 years, which is what you're saying here. If
Oh, I
I'm
wrote
looking,
70 years.
yeah,
You're correct. Okay, it's a typo. We're saying the same
that's
thing.
what I thought.
All right, where did I say it? Where did I
Uh,
write that?
in that paragraph that begins the 2300 years,
It begins the 2300 years. What
uh,
paragraph? How,
uh, it's the one that begins with 207 BC.
okay.
So it's that paragraph, but it's in the sentence that
With
says,
begins with 70 weeks. Okay. It does on mine, it doesn't say it any longer. On yours, it still will, no doubt, because you're using good for you. The 2300 years begins with 70 weeks that identify the end of literal Israel as God's chosen people and the end of the
there you go.
overall period of 2300 years concludes with the Protestant movement ending as the movement carried on unto the Sunday law when the closed door of 1844 is repeated with the closed door upon the Republican horn, the Protestant horn, and the government, which is the beast that has two horns, all come to their end of their probationary time. And what I'm saying in there is that the 250-year prophecy and the 2300-year prophecy that both begin in 457, that the close of probation is at the end of the 2300-year prophecy in 1844. Probation closed for the Protestants in the United States in 1844, and thereafter for the virgins of the Millerite movement in 1844. So 1844, those two closed doors are pointing forward to the two closed doors at the Sunday law, where it closes upon the Democrats and the Adventist Church first, and then it closes for the Virgins and the Republicans second. And 1844 typifies the Sunday law. So the beginning of that time prophecy of 2300 years has 70 marked. It's 70 weeks, but it's understood as probationary time. But now on the external line of 250 years, I'm saying when you get to the end of that, it's external, and it's got to be the last president of the United States that Antiochus is representing, and that's easy to show prophetically. And I'm saying that is marking the close of the Republican horn and the fact that it's in the dead center of Raphia and Pinium, not dead center, but in the center, creating a period of 10 years and 7 years, is Christ's signature of 70 at the end of the 250 years, just as he put the 70 at the alpha of the 2300 years, and they're both connected prophecies. So, for Antiochus to stand between the period of 10 and 7 is to stand at the end of his probationary time. What I was trying to say at the last paragraph in the last couple sentences that I hope we can all get is that the earth beast, the United States, the earth beast of Revelation 13, the beast is the government, and the two horns are republicanism and Protestantism. And they all have their own points in time when they are judged. Okay, the judgment begins at the house of God and thereafter with those outside the house of God. But in the very first time prophecy of covenant history given to Abraham about God's people going into bondage in Egypt for 400 years, and later Paul makes it 430 years. In that time prophecy, it identifies that in the third and fourth generation, God would bring his people out of the bondage of Egypt and he would judge them, but he would also judge the nation where they were at. And that's what happens at the Sunday law, is that the United States is going to get judged and God's people are going to get judged. And then the 11th hour workers are going to get judged thereafter. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of it all, if I could say it that way, you can watch as these lines lay out and you can see when the Republican horn, when the Protestant horn, and when the government close their probation, and they're closer, they're all related, but they're distinctly different. For Antiochus to stand between the period of 10 and 7 is to stand at the end of his probationary time. Probation closes for the government of the United States, which is the earth beast, at the Sunday law. But the Republican horn's probation closes before the Sunday law. Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Okay, so um, the I'm going to figure out how to turn that off, but in any case, don't forget. I think I say it. I'll read it. This is really profound if you get it. The expression 70 times 7 is the only place in the Bible where the numbers are expressed with a multiple in this fashion. Numbers are expressed all over the Bible and in a lot of ways, but the only place where there is a mathematical, whatever you would call it, and I just got a sign on my screen saying my internet connection is unstable, so I'm forewarning everyone. The only place where this 70 times 7, where the word times is used in conjunction with two other words, is this verse here, which equates to 490 years, which equates to 70 weeks at the beginning of the 2300 days, as the alpha in 457, pointing to the omega, with Antiochus standing between Rapha and Panium with the 10 and 7 at the close of his probationary time. The closed door of 1844 represents the closed door of the Sunday law, and before the Sunday law, verse 16, a period of 7 years begins with Antiochus marking the end of his kingdom, and then his kingdom ends at the conclusion of the 7 years. The 7-year period represents the image of the beast's testing time, and the period begins at the first Sunday law of 321. Before the first Sunday law, which typifies the last Sunday law, there will be a 10-year period that begins with an edict. At the edict of 313, the testing represented by 10 years begins. Then Antiochus passes the first Sunday law, and the probation of the Republican horn ends. At the end of 7 years, Paneum and the Sunday law arrive, producing the division of East and West in the year 330. And I'm probably being too specific there. I'm not sure that the Paneum doesn't start in the midst of. Now, what I'm trying to say is, I'm not trying to draw out 7 sequential years. I'm saying the number 7 represents the Sabbath crisis, the Sunday law testing time. And when Paneum actually gets started in there, it could be, the final movements are rapid ones. That's all I want to say. Final movements are rapid ones. Pompey. Pompey conquered the glorious land in verse 16, but within the 2-year period from 65 to 63 BC, Pompey, in fulfillment of Daniel 8 and verse 9, actually conquered the east and the glorious pleasant land, typifying the double conquering in verse 40 and 1989. The double conquering in 1989, we never talk about that, and I've mentioned it in this article. I'll tell you what I mean by that. The papacy spiritually conquered the United States when Reagan formed a secret alliance with the Antichrist, the Bible prophecy. That was a spiritual victory for Rome, and a political victory was sweeping away the Soviet Union. And you can find 3 spiritual victories and 3 political victories in the papacy's return to power, to the healing of its deadly wound. And in verse 40, you have those 2 conquerings, which has been typified by Pompey, who had the first 2 political conquerings for Rome as they came to control the world. He conquered the east and the pleasant land, and then later Augustus was going to deal with the south, with Egypt. The third obstacle for pagan Rome would be accomplished by Augustus Caesar, who is noted for forming the first official Roman triumvirate, representing the first official threefold union in Rome. It is at the third waymark of Roman leaders that the threefold union is officially marked in Roman history. It is at the Sunday law in verse 16 that the threefold union of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet is established, and then the bird of wickedness is set back upon her place in Shinar, as set forth by Zechariah. Augustus Caesar formed the first official Roman triumvirate, but it is called the second triumvirate by the historians, for Julius Caesar also formed a triumvirate, but it was not an official triumvirate of the Roman government. The relation of Julius and Augustus Caesar as symbols of the threefold union of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet at the soon coming Sunday law is typified by Julius at the beginning of the movement to enforce Sunday legislation and Augustus at the end. The prophetic relationship is also represented by the siege of Cestius in 67, which was thereafter followed by the siege of Titus. Julius is Cestius, and Augustus is Titus. Julius and Augustus represent the threefold union, and Cestius and Titus represent a siege. The period when the movement for a Sunday law begins prophetically in 313 at the Edict of Milan. Then in 321, at the midpoint of the 17-year period, the first Sunday law arrived. The third step of the division of the kingdom into East and West, representing the division in the United States into those who receive and those who don't receive the mark of the beast or the seal of God, was 330. There is a series of Sunday laws which lead to a Sunday law, and 321 represents the first Sunday law that leads to the last Sunday law of 330. Unlike the 250 years of Antiochus, the 250 years of Nero identify a period of 8 years, the midpoint of the first Sunday law, and then 9 years. Line upon line, Antiochus and Nero identify 2 periods that are placed between 3 waymarks in both not between, place within, probably, I should say. In both lines, the first and the last way marks are the same. An edict at the beginning that was marked by a marriage that ended with a divorce, and a battle between the king of the north and the king of the south at the beginning and ending. The first Sunday law of 321 in the middle must be where Antiochus is standing. He is standing at the conclusion of a testing process represented by 10 years, and the testing process manifests Antiochus as the eighth who is of the seven, as he forms an image of the beast who is the eighth that is of the seven. At the same time, the 144,000 go through a testing process and transform from the seventh Laodicean church unto the eighth and Philadelphian church. At the first Sunday law, the erection of the image begins and ends at the Sunday law of Revelation 13, verse 11, a verse that contrasts the beginning of the United States as a lamb with its ending as a dragon. 13 is the symbol of rebellion, and the symbol of rebellion in the context of verse 11 and the United States speaking as a dragon is the mark of the beast, whereas the symbol of those who have the seal of God is the number 11. Revelation 13:11 identifies the separation of those that receive the mark of the beast or the seal of God at the Sunday law when the United States speaks as a dragon in Revelation 13:11. The image of the beast testing time has specific signs that mark its arrival while also typifying its end. From Noah to the Feast of Trumpets, God never changes. He always announces a testing period in advance of its arrival. His announcements are found in his prophetic word. Most Adventists, I'm assuming, do not know that there were two sieges in the destruction of Jerusalem, or that the day of the final destruction was the identical day of the year that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and the temple the first, Alpha time. They might also be unaware that the sieges began at sacred feast and ended on a sacred feast, or that the period of the siege was 3 years and a half. If they don't know those facts, then it seems unlikely they will see that Julius Caesar marks the beginning of the image of the beast testing time in its most perfect representation. By perfect representation, I mean its final fulfillment. The same period is represented from 1888 unto the Sunday law, and then again from 9/11 unto the Sunday law. But the perfect fulfillment of the prophetic period of the setting up of the image of the beast is represented by Constantine the Great in the period of 313 through to 330, begins in the presidency of the eighth president since the time of the end in 1989. From the first Sunday law, the testing period over Sabbath and Sunday unfolds in a period represented by the 7 years of Antiochus. The 7 years of Antiochus line multiplied by 9 years of Nero line equals 63. And in 63 BC, Pompey conquered the glorious land in fulfillment of verse 16 of Daniel 11. At the Sunday law, 9 kings will acknowledge the United States as the premier king of 10 kings that agree to give their kingdom to the whore of Tyre, who is then to commit fornications with all the kings of the earth. In agreement with the prophetic structure of the parable of the 10 virgins, the marriage of the beast and the false prophet was accomplished in 1989, but at the Sunday law, the marriage is consummated. A fractal of that history is the period of the judgment of the living that began in 2001 on 9/11. From that point to the Sunday law, the image of the beast testing time, which is also the sealing time of the 144,000, judgment is accomplished upon God's covenant people and the land where they have resided in fulfillment of Abraham's covenant prophecy. In that period, the Laodicean Seventh-day Adventist Church is judged, and then those who profess to be virgins are judged. Thus, the Protestant horn is judged, and it is judged during the period when first the Democratic Party of the Republican horn was judged in 2024, when the judgment of the Republicans of the Republican horn is now being judged. I need to rewrite that sentence, but I think you get my point. The judgment came upon the Seventh-day Adventist Church first, in terms of the Protestant horn, and upon the virgins of this movement second, and it came upon the Democratic Party first, and you could probably mark that as 2020 instead of 2024. That'll be 2024 is when Republican judgment began. The constitutional government is the beast that carries the two horns and is judged at the Sunday law. And brothers and sisters, the Bible is clear. We've went through this in past Zoom meetings. The Bible is clear that one way that God expresses the Laodicean condition of God's people at the end of the world is they do not understand the judgment of God. And what we're talking about here is details about the judgment of the living that there isn't anyone else on planet Earth that's discussing, but is what I understand to be airtight. Okay, we're coming to the conclusion of the judgment of the living, and the Lord doesn't bring people to the close of their probation without giving a warning message. And if this isn't that warning message, I don't know what to say. From 1989 to the Sunday law is represented in a fractal from 9/11 into the Sunday law, but the perfect fulfillment of the setting up of the image of the beast is in the eighth president that is of the seven. Nero's 17 years is a fractal of the history of 9/11 to the Sunday law. Antiochus's 17 years is the same. The marriage of Reagan and the secret alliance is consummated with an open alliance in the eighth president's term. The first of the Alpha and Omega marriages was symbolized by the Patriot Act in 2001, when English law was changed to Roman law. The marriage of the Edict of Milan marks the beginning of the perfect fulfillment of the setting up of the image of the beast. Its structure is based upon the structure of the marriage of the 10 virgins and represents the counterfeit marriage that occurs during the same time as the true marriage. The image of the beast testing time represents the test we must pass before we are sealed. The house of God is judged first, and then at the Sunday law, those outside of God's house are judged. The period of final judgment in both the house of God and then in the great multitude begins with the first Sunday law. There will be a first Sunday law in the United States, which will mark the beginning of the perfect and final fulfillment of the image of the beast testing period that thereafter ends at the Sunday law, which fulfills Revelation 13:11. That Sunday law is the last Sunday law in the glorious land. That last Sunday law in the glorious land is the first Sunday law in the world, marking the image of the beast testing time for the world. The world testing time begins at the Sunday law in the United States in verse 11 of chapter 13. When the United States speaks as a dragon at the soon coming Sunday law, verses 12 and onward in the chapter represent the world image of the beast testing time. For this reason, and by the way, I'll give you my apologies once. I was telling my son here within this past week, I've been all these articles I've been writing, I have purposely been writing them to try to keep them simple. So if someone that hasn't come across these concepts reads them, they can get drawn in and not just scared away from deep complexity. But I'm no longer, I don't have the freedom to do that anymore. And I realize that some of these things that I'm writing now are much more complex than in the past, but that's just the way it's got to be. There's too many lines that Christ has opened up now, almost simultaneously. You can't just take note of them and move on, take note of them, move on. You have to bring them together. And when you start bringing them together, it requires a little bit of effort for the student of prophecy. And we're all called to be students of prophecy. And there's never been another time in Earth's history where there was a higher calling to be a student of prophecy than now. And that's why it might be a little bit complex, and hopefully we can straighten it out with the illustrations afterwards. For this reason, the 250-year prophecy of Nero that ends with the 17 years beginning at the edict in 313, followed by the first Sunday law in 321, then division of East and West in 330 is important to see. The three steps of Nero's line are about persecution. Nero being a symbol of persecution, and the 250-year period representing the Church of Smyrna that ended in 313 when the Church of Compromise arrived. The third step marks the end of a kingdom. So when applied to the United States, it represents the Sunday law and the transition from the sixth kingdom to the seventh and eighth kingdoms. When applied to the world, the third waymark is the close of human probation that was typified by the close of probation for the United States at the beginning of the world testing period of the image of the beast. This is why Augustus Caesar, the third of the four Roman rulers who lead to the Sunday law, represented by the cross, as set forth in verse 22, can represent the cross, even though he is to be followed by Tiberius, who also represents the cross. The image of the beast testing period is a twofold test. It is a twofold test. That first test, plural, the earth and then the sea. Okay, the image of the beast takes place in the United States and then in the world. The United States is the earth and the world is the sea. The image of the beast is a twofold test that first tests the earth and then the sea. The earth is the United States and sea is the world. The image of the beast test produces a doubling of signs, where the alpha of the second period is also the omega of the first period. 321 was the first Sunday law of prophetic history, and in the 17 years identifying the image of the beast testing time, 321 is the first Sunday law in the United States that leads to the Omega Sunday law of the image of the beast testing time in the glorious land. Yet 321 is also the first Sunday law for the world. So the year 321 marks the middle of both the beginning and the ending of the image of the beast testing time. 313 is the beginning, and the beginning is an edict, which typifies the Sunday law. The 17 years of Nero identify a period of escalating Sunday laws through to the close of human probation. An edict is a Sunday law. The first Sunday law in 321 is the Sunday law, and the close of probation is the Sunday law. All three of those waymarks are Sunday laws, just like all four of the Roman rulers are Sunday laws. We'll show you that in a second. The edict typifies the first Sunday law that leads to the close of probation. Pompey took Judah in verse 16, typifying the Sunday law. And Julius Caesar formed the first triumvirate, that was an unofficial threefold union. The historians still mark it as the first. Julius Caesar's typification of the Sunday law's threefold union typified Augustus Caesar's official triumvirate that was followed by Tiberius at the cross. All four Roman rulers typified the Sunday law, as do all three steps of Nero's 17 years. Pompey aligns with 1989. Julius aligns with verse 11. Augustus aligns with verse 15. And Tiberius with verse 16. The story of Julius in the verses include his foray into Egypt and Cleopatra. The history gets repeated by Mark Antony. Mark Antony was Julius Caesar's main general at the time when Julius was assassinated with 23, not with 23 stab wounds. 23 represents the Sunday law, and Julius' death at 23 is a kingdom ending at the Sunday law. Mark Antony, Augustus Caesar, and Marcus Lepidus then formed the first official triumvirate to avenge his death. One of those threefold powers, Mark Antony, was going to repeat Julius's encounter with Egypt and Cleopatra. Whether Julius or Mark Antony, they are both symbols of Rome, and Cleopatra was a symbol of Egypt and Greece. She represented Greek rulership in Egypt, both symbols of the dragon, whereas Julius and Mark Antony are symbols of the beast. As the woman in the relation, Cleopatra was the church, making Julius and Mark Antony the state. Cleopatra represents a woman that is twice separated from her kingly lovers, first in 1798, and then at the close of probation when she comes to her end with none to help. Her final demise is at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. The victor at the Battle of Actium was Augustus Caesar. So we find that Pompey died in Egypt. Julius had an encounter with Cleopatra in Egypt that was doubled in the history of Mark Antony. And then Augustus Caesar ends that relationship at Actium. And that's the signature of truth, with a doubling in the middle, with the anyway, it's amazing how it keeps popping up. Pompey's the beginning, Augustus is the ending in this illustration, and in the middle you have the two forays into Egypt and Cleopatra doubling Julius Caesar in there, showing the three angels' messengers, and at that history, leaving Tiberius off of verse 22 in the cross, at that history, looking at the three Roman symbols in that fashion, you have the threefold conquering, two at the beginning with Pompey, Augustus at Actium, third, Rome's now sitting on the throne of the earth. But there's several other lines or wheels within wheels happening here. Pompey took the first two obstacles and Augustus the third, and out of one of them came forth the little horn, which waxed exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the pleasant land. Daniel 8:9. Pompey is 1989, the first waymark of three political powers to be overcome by modern Rome as its deadly wound is healed. The Soviet Union, followed by the United States and also the United Nations in verse 41 of Daniel 11. Is to be followed. The warfare of the papal power is political and religious, and prophetically, the religious power of the United States was conquered when the secret alliance of Reagan and Pope John Paul II was accomplished. The papacy's target included three political obstacles and three religious powers. In 1989, one of the three political powers was swept away. Protestantism, as an actual word that means to protest Rome, was also swept away by the President of the United States in the same history. The three political powers are the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Nations, and the religious targets are Protestantism, along with the various religions of the dragon, which are all considered spiritualism. The three religions that are to lead the world to Armageddon are apostate Protestantism, Catholicism, and spiritualism, and the papal power's internal struggles between conservative and liberal ideology within her church, along with the schisms of Orthodox Catholicism, is a religious obstacle, and the other two religious obstacles for Catholicism to conquer are apostate Protestantism and spiritualism. Protestantism was swept away in 1989. Spiritualism is getting swept away right now in terms of being conquered in the Battle of Raphia. In the internal struggles of Catholicism, if the internal struggles of Catholicism is represented in the various Catholic prophecies derived from the messages of Fatima, are separated from her efforts to overcome the religious powers outside her own religion, Then her alpha victory over Protestantism was Reagan's secret alliance, and her omega victory was the open alliance of 2025. Her struggles with Orthodox churches are portrayed from initial victory in 1989 until the final victory at Panium. And Panium is marking the final victory over all this is where all the churches join. It's right there at the Sunday law. And Panium is emphasizing religious, and Actium that starts right there is emphasizing political. And for this reason, when Peter he gets into this history sooner or later, Lord willing, he's at Panium, and Christ tells him, upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell, the grotto of Pan, will not prevail against it. So Panium is a symbol of the great controversy in the context of religion, true and false religion. And Actium is the great controversy in terms of statecraft. This aligns Augustus with Panium of verse 15 and verse 11's Battle of Raphia with Julius. The Battle of Panium is the Third World War that begins just before the Sunday Law, verse 16, but then transforms into the Battle of Actium. Panium was the earth battle of the United States, and Actium was the sea battle of the world. Augustus is represented at Panium in the line of 4 Roman rulers, and he was the actual leader at Actium. At Panium, Antiochus dealt with Egypt, who was allied with Rome, and at Actium, Augustus dealt with Egypt, Cleopatra, allied with Rome, Mark Antony. This means Pompey represents verse 40 up to 1989, and Tiberius represents the Sunday Law, verse 41. Julius Caesar arrived in 2014 when the Ukrainian War began, as typified at by the Battle of Raphia in 2017 BC, 217 BC. This identifies that verses 17 through 22 begin in 1989 and end at the Sunday Law, and therefore the history that aligns and are therefore the history that aligns with the hidden history of verse 40. The prophetic line of the Maccabees also aligns with the very same hidden history. The line of Roman rulers is identifying modern Rome, the beast of Revelation 16, and the line of the Maccabees is describing the glorious land, the false prophet of Revelation 16. The line of the 3 battles identifies the victory over the king of the south, the dragon of Revelation 16. Those 3 lines represent the 3 world powers that lead the world to Armageddon, and they're represented in verse 40 as the king of the south, the dragon, the king of the north, the beast, and the chariots, horsemen, and ships are the false prophet. The 3 lines from verse 10 to 23 are representing the 3 powers in the hidden history of verse 40 that are nothing more or less than an ongoing illustration of the 3 subjects represented in the open history of verse 40. I hope you get this. What I'm saying here is that verse 40 begins in 1798, and at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, that's the end of the information that we can take out of the words. I think it's 51 words that make up verse 40. They come to an end in 1989. But the hidden history that we've been looking at from 1989 until verse 41 Sunday Law, all 3 of these lines from verse 10 on through to verse 23 all creates 3 lines. It creates the Maccabean line of the glorious land, the false prophet. It creates the 4 Roman rulers, the line of the beast, and it creates the proxy wars of the dragon, that struggle. All 3 of those lines have mark 1989 as their starting point, they concluded the Sunday law and they fill in that hidden history. But one of them's emphasizing the dragon, which in the open history of verse 40 was the king of the south. And another one of the lines is representing the glorious land, which was the chariots, ships, and horsemen of the open part of verse 40. And the king of the north in the open part of verse 40 is represented by the four Roman rulers. Got it. Got it. All right. So it's absolutely profound. Those verses, they plug into the hidden history, and all they are is a continuation of testimony about the three powers that we understood in verse 40 from 1798 to 1989. It's absolutely profound. If you can get the logic and it sinks in, you'll say amen. Verse 1. Verses 1 through 4 identify the time of the end in 1989, as well as the 8 presidents of the United States from that starting point, and concluding with the final and far richer 8th president. In verse 4, that king becomes the king of the world, as represented by Alexander the Great, King Ahab, the 10 kings of Revelation 17, the 10 tribes of Psalms 83, the 10 nations set forth as a symbol of the world, uh, as set forth as a symbol of the world in the very first step of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15:18 through 21. The first 4 verses of Daniel 11 identify the time of the end in 1989, the 8 presidents from Reagan to Trump, the transition from the United States into the premier king of the 10 kings of the United Nations in those first 4 verses. So you would put them in the hidden history beginning in 1989. They do just what the 3 lines from verse 10 to 23 do. They grab 1989 as the starting point, and then they tell a history that fits into the hidden history of verse 40. And those first 4 verses are talking about Donald Trump. They're talking about the president of the United States that becomes the president of the United Nations as he forms an image of the beast in the United States and then forces the world to do the same. Verse 1 through 4 represent the history of 1989 until the threefold union of the Sunday law in verse 41. Therefore, they align with the 4 Roman rulers, the line of the Maccabees, and as the 3 battles of verses 10 through 15, which together make up the hidden history of verse 40. Verses 5 through 9 set forth the prophetic line, which perfectly represents the history of 538 to 1798, provides the historical and prophetic logic to understand the significance of the time of the end in verse 40. That logic explains verse 10 as the retaliation for the history of verses 5 through 9, and in so doing, it defines the logic of 1989. This means that verses 1 through 23 of Daniel 11 represent 5 prophetic lines that are aligned with the hidden history of verse 40. The first 4 verses are about Trump, the 8th president, who is of the 7, who is destined to be the king of the 10 kings in Revelation 17, 7th kingdom. Verses 5 through 10 identify the history leading to 1798 and on to 1989, which is the history of verse 40. Verse 10 through 15 identify a history of 3 proxy wars beginning in 1989, the second beginning in 2014. Then the richest president stood up in 2015. That richest president was slain in 2020. And in 2022, the War of Rafah escalated, and then the richest president returned in 2024, and in 2025 the head of the beast and the head of the image of the beast were both inaugurated. We will continue these things in the next article. So before we go to some illustrations, I got a little bit of challenge on what prophetic authority is there to say that just because the current Pope, Pope Leo, was inaugurated in 2025, and Donald Trump was inaugurated in 2025. It's not as if they shook hands or formed an open alliance. What prophetic authority is there to identify that as a fulfillment of Rome establishing the vision in verse 14 of Daniel 11, and also of being the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in a place where he ought not? Is it a valid application? And my answer is yeah, it's absolutely valid. And the way the question was asked me, it clicked something on in my brain. I never answered it at the time. But I'm not saying that in 2025, when Pope Leo was inaugurated and Trump was inaugurated for his second term in 2025, that they joined hands in the public arena. I'm saying they joined hands prophetically. And that kind of application, we've handled that kind of application for years, and this is the example that dropped into my head. You can go through the prophetic testimony when Sister White's commenting on the first, second, and third angels when they arrived in Millerite history. She comments on each of those angels, and she said that all three of them had a message in their hand. And she said the first angel's work was to lighten the earth with his glory, which made the first angel the same as the third angel. And we know that this is true because the first angel is the Alpha and the third is the Omega. And the first angel arrives in 1798 with a message in his hand. The second arrives in 1844 with a message in his hand. And the third arrives in 1844 with a message in his hand. But we know that that first angel, when he empowered his message on August 11th, 1840, he came down in Revelation 10 with a little book open in his hand. So that in Millerite history, you've got four direct references of angels when they come down, they have a message in their hand, a little book. So, based upon those four witnesses, we look at Revelation 18, and Revelation 18 doesn't say anything about the mighty angel that's going to lighten the earth with his glory at 9/11 having any book in his hand. But you know that he's been typified by the first angel of Revelation 14 that arrived in 1798 that Sister White said had a message in his hand. And he was also typified as the same angel in Revelation 10 where it says he had a book in his hand. And what I'm saying is that Ronald Reagan represents the beginning, and his relationship with the Antichrist of Bible prophecy wasn't a casual incident in that history. It was that history. This history is about the healing of the deadly wound that first takes place in the United States, and then the United States forces the whole world to accept the papacy. So when you see Ronald Reagan, the president, the first of eight in 1989, working with a secret alliance with the Antichrist of Bible prophecy, then you know that as the first, he's got to illustrate the last. And the eighth president is the last. The eighth president is Trump. So there has to be some kind of relationship that has been typified by Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II that is addressed with Donald Trump. And what I'm saying is that it's marking for us internally that the foundational test that began in 2024 was a ended in 2025 when the Pope and Trump were both inaugurated because they become this final president, the symbol of the final president's relationship with the papacy. And in so doing, they become the warning that is preceding what's about to happen in 2026 and onward. Okay. And what's about to happen in 2026 and onward is that as one example, Cestius is going to put up a siege. And when Cestius plants his banners in the sacred precincts of the temple, God's people are to flee, okay? Because they understood the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in a place where he ought not, or standing in the holy place. Zechariah tells us that the the glorious land is the Holy Land. Okay, when he chooses Jerusalem, he's going to place them in the Holy Land. We're seeing a pope from the Holy Land standing inaugurated where he ought not, and it's a pope that has been typified as in a relationship with a president, and the relationship that was typified by Ronald Reagan was a secret, unholy alliance identify an open alliance at the end that marks the end of the foundational test in the testing process of the virgins, which is 3 steps: foundational, temple, and then litmus test. And in 2025, the the end of the foundational test, which is based upon the argument of Daniel 11, verse 14, does Rome establish the vision? And in 2025, Rome comes back in an open prophetic alliance, symbolic alliance with Trump and Pope Leo. It marks confirmation that it's Rome that establishes the vision and ends that foundational testing process. But where Rome is standing in Thessalonians is he's standing in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And the temple of God was raised up in the United States. It's the glorious land. So when this fulfillment takes place, it is a warning, not simply that the foundational test has passed for the virgins and that we're now in the temple test, but it's saying part of the temple test is to recognize the satanic temple that has been brought together as the abomination of desolation of represented by modern Rome. And let me turn this off. Oh, I can't turn it off. Okay, so I enough on that. I lost track of my thoughts. Let's go to this. Um, all right. Let's take a 10-minute break or a 5-minute, 10-minute break and come back and go through these, if you don't mind. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank you for the information that we've covered here this morning so far, and we ask that you give us a refreshing that we can come back and put some of these concepts into a visual representation according to your will. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask for your Holy Spirit to be with us now as we look at some of these illustrations and discuss the implications of them. Thank you for the rain that you've poured out upon us today, and we ask that you would do likewise with the spiritual rain at this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Just some look at, I got to figure out what I'm trying to share here to get started with. Oh, okay. I'll tell you what the premise of these slides were when I started on them. The the ability to teach its message now to me, I don't have it any longer. It's too big, and what I find myself doing, as I'm so amazed by it, is I go back to December 31st, 2023, when you can show that's the point in time that the revelation of Jesus Christ began to be unsealed. And I was right there when it was happening, so that being said, it doesn't mean a whole lot if you're there when it was happening and you're just traveling along the line. And now you look back, it's not that long ago, and you look at the various truths that have been opened up since that time. And so I was going to try to do a presentation today graphically to cover the truths that have been opened up since that time. Because at the end of being dead in the street for 3.5 days, that's a symbol of 1260, and the 1260 is a wilderness. And the wilderness concludes in 1798 after 1260 years of wilderness, or it concludes in 1989 after 126 years from 1863 to 1989 after a wilderness. The book of Daniel is unsealed in 1798 and 1989, and then in Revelation 11, after 3.5 days, it's unsealed for the 144,000. Okay, 1,260 years, 126 years, and then 3.5 years. The point that I was going to start is the first thing that was unsealed is our responsibility to parallel Daniel in chapter 9, praying the Leviticus 26 prayer, where he found himself in the enemy's land scattered, and Leviticus 26 informs God's people what they're supposed to do when they find themselves scattered, and it includes confessing their sins and the sins of their fathers, and acknowledging that during the scattering time that God wasn't leading you. He was walking contrary to you because you were walking contrary to them. So I remember a brother that had been in this movement for years. When we came back on, that was the issue with him, is that he could not believe that God would have given us a message that we could be disappointed over. It just, that couldn't be the way to relate to that. It couldn't be the first disappointment, because there wasn't going to be a first disappointment. But the reality was, it's 2020. 2020 is not, it's designed by God to take place at 2020, just like 9/11 was designed to take place at 9/11. It's when you see the significance of July 18th, 2020, and the stolen election of 2020, you see the slaying of the street in the street of the two witnesses. And after 3.5 days, December 31st, 2023, the Lord unseals, like he did in 1989 and like he did in 1798, like he's did other times in sacred history. He began unsealing the revelation of Jesus Christ, and one of the things that he unsealed was a truth about the two sticks being joined together in Ezekiel 37. So I'm saying that there, in this top left-hand corner of this particular slide, where it says Daniel 8, 13, and 14, that verse 13 is the question and verse 14 is the answer. And the question is, how long shall these two desolating powers, paganism and papalism, trample down the sanctuary and the host? And the answer in verse 14 is 2,300 days. But when you sort through Daniel 8, 13, and 14, it's the foundation for understanding the connection between the 2520 and the 2,300. And the two sticks in Ezekiel 37 are identifying the joining together of the two lines of 2520, that you can find the starting point in Isaiah 7, verse 8 of both those lines, one in 723, one in 677. And when you get to the conclusion of the two sticks being joined together in Ezekiel 37, the promise is we will know who God is when he places his sanctuary in our midst forevermore. And he's going to be in our midst forevermore is one of the promises, and that he's going to write his law upon our hearts and minds is one of the promises there in Ezekiel 37. And that David, our king and our prince, would rule over us forever. So Ezekiel 37 is taking you to the point where the covenant with 144,000 is put in place, and David began to reign when he was 30 years old, and Ezekiel began to reign as a prophet when he was 30 years old, and he reigned for 22 years. He served for 22 years, and Joseph began his service when he was 30 years old. So this 30-year history, um, it's a signature upon those that are represented by the church triumphant that's made up as a prophet, priest, and king, um, earthly priests, prophet, and kings, represented by these three figures, David, Ezekiel, and Joseph. But beginning at 30 years old, that's the age of the priests. So when you relate to them all as priests, then they're the 80 priests that are human, that are connected with the high priest that is divine. And the number 81 is representing the combination of the high priest with his holy nation that is a kingdom of priests. All right. So the Lord began opening these things up, but he also opened up that the northern kingdom and the time prophecy of 2,520 years represented the lower nature of man, his flesh, and that the 2520 against Judah against the southern kingdom represented mankind's mind. It was the higher nature and the lower nature, the lower being the flesh, the higher being the mind. And the conclusion of those two lines in history formed 46 years, which is the formation of a temple that up on the top of this screen, the top right-hand corner, you see 46, that's the temple. And in 1844, Sister White says directly, October 22nd, 1844, the parable of the 10 virgins was fulfilled. Daniel 7:13 was fulfilled when Christ came to receive a kingdom. Daniel 8:14 was fulfilled when he began the work of the investigative judgment. And Malachi 3 was fulfilled when he came as the messenger of the covenant, entering into covenant with the Levites that he had put through a purification process. So we began to see that in 1844, the work of Christ was to bring divinity and humanity together, and that unlike we had seen before, these two lines of 2520, they represent the salvation story of man's fallen condition, uh, the northern kingdom symbolizing the flesh, the lower nature that was supposed to be in subjection to the higher nature. That's how Adam and Eve were created, with the higher nature ruling over the lower nature, and at sin it got reversed. And so these two sticks, representing the higher and lower nature of man, they're represented as the flesh being in the ascendancy, being the northern kingdom, and the mind being the southern kingdom. And along with that story, the line of the 2520, which is the lower fleshly nature, it only goes to 1798 because the flesh cannot be transformed until the second coming of Christ. Whereas at conversion, you can have the mind of Christ. You can crucify the carnal mind and take the mind of Christ. So the line of the higher nature, the southern kingdom that began in 677, it comes to 1844 and it connects with the 2300 year prophecy that began in 457, 220 years after 677. And when they come together in 1844, the the green on your screen, I don't know if color comes through on these Zoom meetings or not, but the higher nature that joins with the 457 BC, the 2300 year prophecy in 1844, uh, it's identifying the combination of divinity and humanity that was supposed to happen in 1844, but due to rebellion, the last 19 years of Isaiah 7, verse 8, took you to 1863 when the wilderness wandering began for Adventism. And it was a wilderness until 1989 because it was 126 years. So when you get to look at the implications of what's being taught with those two 2520 time prophecies, the higher and the lower nature, and the higher nature joining, it taking the citadel of our souls and our higher nature and joining them in the citadel of God's sanctuary, That is where the atonement takes place. That is what it means to follow Christ into the most holy place by faith. That is the test of the temple is to follow into that experience. Okay, so now that wasn't so long ago. That's at the beginning of 2024. We begin to see that, and now we have a 250-year time period that also begins in 457 and it ends in 207 BC. But what I want you to see is that in 207 BC, I'm at the bottom of the screen now, if you're wondering, on the line that starts in 742 to 1863 with an alpha 19 years and an omega 19 years. Underneath that, it lining up with 457 and the 2300-year prophecy. I guess I can mark this for you, make sure you're following me on this. Um, Down here, this is the 2300-year prophecy, but it begins in 457, as does this 250-year time prophecy. And in 207, you're right in between. This here is the Battle of Raphia, and this is the Battle of Panium. But what's happening in verse 16 over here, this is verse 16, this is Rome. Rome is now, Pompey is going to begin to conquer the three obstacles to place pagan Rome on the throne of the earth. So what's happening in 207 BC is a change of dispensation. Okay, the Seleucid kingdom is coming to its conclusion and the Roman kingdom is rising. In this history of Antiochus the Great between Raphia and Panium, it is the transition of the United States from the sixth kingdom of Bible prophecy unto the seventh, the head of the seventh kingdom of Bible prophecy at the Sunday law. Now, why that is important to see is that's down here. This is a transition down here of the Seleucid kingdom to the Roman kingdom. But for us, it's from the sixth kingdom to the seventh kingdom and the eighth kingdom right there. And at the beginning in 457, that is the third decree, 457 of three decrees. And those three decrees, the third is the litmus. And what happened with the third decree is the national sovereignty was restored. So you have the beginning of a nation here in 457, and in the history of 207 verses 11 through 16, you have a transition of a nation. And at the end of the 2300 years up here of this 457 line, you have the end of the Protestants in the United States. And when we understand that the 2300 years also illustrates the Sunday law, you have the end of the United States. Point is this, that the beginning waymark of 457 is a change in dispensation, and the ending of the 2300 years and the ending of the 250 years is also, they're all changes in dispensation, which means they bear the signature of Alpha and Omega. There's we could spend the rest of the day perhaps if we were prepared on the two sticks, but that wasn't my intent. My intent was to show how some of these things are getting tied together now. And I tell you what, some of my hesitancy about these articles that I'm writing now is I'm fearful that it's just a lot of most of the input's coming from me without any check. This is too big, it's too profound and too important for me to stumble through it all by myself. And I sometimes wonder what's going on in that regard about how the Lord's opening this up. Um, So my um, recognition now in this article that I started off is I'm starting to try to explain how I understand the Nashville prediction, the warning, the correction is, and as I look at the implications that these lines that we're laying out now that have come to light here recently, um, it's a scary message. It's it's a difficult message to put out there and do it properly. I mean, it's there's never been a straighter message. There isn't any kid on the block, punch in the eye. You're nailing everyone in the world. Okay, so you're going to have no friends out there, and but the Lord keeps opening these lines up, and the lines are starting to focus in implications about what the waymarks represent that are they're serious. Okay, so anyway, let's look at some of these lines. Um, Up here on the top corner, 457 is the third decree, and it goes to 1844, which is the third angel's message. But 1844, it's typifying the Sunday law down here, which is the third angel's message. Okay, so the 23 I got there is for the 2300-year prophecy. And I'm emphasizing, of course, the number 23 as a symbol of the work of Christ in the Day of Atonement. So up here, the reason these little green lines are going down this way is I'm saying that the line that begins in 457 and goes to 1844, and in doing so typifies the Sunday law. These two lines up here on the top, um, this one and this one, they represent an internal line of 457. But down here with Antiochus, this is the external line of 457. All right, that's what this is about. Um, Antiochus is 250 years. It takes you to, this might not be clear enough. It takes you to here. This is the 250 years. And it takes you to a midpoint. And when I say a midpoint, the, like I mentioned to Jeremy when we began, that I had noticed that the song was saying it was Desire of Ages chapter 21 when I knew it was chapter 22, just because I had been looking again at chapter 11 to 22 in Genesis and Matthew and Revelation, and then I recognized it in the Desire of Ages as well. And I haven't followed through in the Desire of Ages. I don't know how to pick a center point of those chapters like you can do with the verses. You can take chapter 11 to chapter 22 in Genesis, Matthew, and Revelation, and you can count the verses and you can find the center point. And if you remember, the center point of Genesis is the second step of the covenant with Abraham. It's where it says, "Thou shalt circumcise on the seventh day, eighth day." Sorry. And then the center point for Matthew chapters 11 through 22 is Christ saying, changing Peter's name to Peter, marking him as 144,000 and saying, "Upon this rock will I build my church." Okay. And then the center point in Revelation 11 through 22 is Revelation 17, where the beast, the eighth is of the seven, enigma of Rome, that is repeated with the image of Rome in the United States and is repeated with the internal line in the churches, the 144,000 being the eighth church that is of the seven, Trump being the eighth president that is of the seven, and the deadly wound being healed makes the papacy the eighth that is of the seven. So I'm not sure why I lost my track of thought why I got off there. But anyway, Antiochus over here, he's bringing, oh, center point. I've been looking at these center points. The, the center of these three lines of chapter 11 to 22, um, it's it's like the center point on Daniel 12. Daniel 12, if you haven't remembered it, verse 7 or 8, I'll say verse 7. I'm going to go with verse 7. Could be 8. I'll look it up so I'm having the right point of reference. I think it's verse 7. Daniel 12, verse 7 says, yes, when he had accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. Well, the holy people in the last days are the two witnesses in Revelation 11 that are scattered for a times and a half, for 3.5 days. And there comes a point when it's finished. That's December 31st, 2023. And then down here in verse 12, 12, 12, which is 144, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. Well, that's April 19th, 1844, and it's July 18th, 2020. So verse 12 is giving us the first disappointment, because that's where you get your clear vision, when you can see the first disappointment for what it is. That's the 2020 vision, because then you can see this history in the context of the parable of the 10 virgins and other things. And verse 7 is marking the end of the scattering time in December 31st and of 2023. And verse 12 is July 18th, 2020, and verse 11, 12:11, and all these is 12:7, which has some really cool prophetic numbers, and so does 12:11, and so does 12:12. But the middle one in there is the 1290 years. It's understood as 30 years followed by 1260 years, the way the pioneers understood it. And those 1260 years are the period of papal rule, which in Revelation 13 is a symbolic 42 months. Okay, that the papacy is going to reign from the Sunday law in the United States until human probation closes. And it's preceded by 30 years. And the 30 years represents the history of 1989 until the Sunday law, which is a period of time that the Lord is raising up a priesthood, a church triumphant for the Sunday law crisis, an ensign. So that's a symbolic 30 years right there in the middle of those three steps. Okay, the middle of those three steps doesn't just tie you into 1989 to the Sunday law and then the papacy ruling for 42 months. It ties you into the very first time prophecy dealing with God's people, which is Abram's 400 years, which along with Paul is 430 years, identifying right from the start the covenant time prophecy is the time prophecy that is one time prophecy that has part of it that's 30, representing the priests. Okay, so that's the center of the testimony in the center of the three steps in Daniel 12. Okay, like it's the second angel's message, like is the second step in Genesis 11 to 22 being the act of circumcision, and Peter's name changed. Circumcision is a sign. Peter's name being changed is the 144,000 that are going to be the ensign, and they are going to be the priesthood that are raised up as represented in this 30 years from 1989 unto the Sunday law. And then in 1996, the message that was unsealed in 1989 was formalized. And 30 years later, in 2026, the Lord is saying, now you need to formalize the midnight cry message. Okay, 30 years later. And when you get to the two sticks, they'll let you know that when the Lord does enter into covenant with the 144,000, it's going to be with 30-year-olds leading the church. David the king, Ezekiel the prophet, Joseph the priest. and they are the priesthood of the high priest. They are 81. So why am I saying all that? I'm saying it for this reason. These midpoints, they're like right here under Antiochus, this midpoint, this means something. You got to watch the midpoints. That's what the midpoint of chapter 11 through 22, profound in all three books, Genesis, Revelation, and Matthew. The midpoint here in Nero's is the first Sunday law. Uh, and I don't know of a midpoint here, except that this is the midterms. So he's at a midpoint here at Trump, in Trump's history. So let me see what I'm leaving out of here of what I want you to see. In Nero's history, you have an 8 and a 9. In Antiochus's history, you have a 10 and a 7. I purposely have Antiochus and Nero offset. I didn't want to lead anyone to make any automatic assumptions that the Battle of Raphia aligns with 313 down here. I didn't want to do that, so I didn't. But I did want to show the three-step structure. July 4th, the United States, it begins with a 22-year period, and it ends down here at the cross in verse 22 of Daniel 11. So it's 22:22. Up here in the upper right-hand corner, 1989, right here, this is the hidden history where all of these lines are ending up. All right, so Nero, it's 250 years. I know I haven't really looked what the Bible scholars identify technically as the history of the Church of Smyrna. They no doubt will maybe start before Nero, maybe not, maybe after Nero. I know that Polycarp, no, not Polycarp. Anyway, I know there's a persecution of, his name isn't popping into my head, that was the most fierce during the history of Smyrna that lasted 10 days, 10 years. And that's not my point. My point is that this is a valid application of Smyrna. Nero is a symbol of persecution, and 250 years later, the persecution ended. Nero is a symbol of Smyrna, and when the 250 years ended, you're right in the history of Constantine the Great and the history that illustrates the setting up of the image of the beast in the first Sunday laws, and that's Pergamus. And that's the top line here. The second line is pagan Rome conquering the world. Pompey got the first two obstacles. He got Syria in 65 BC. I'm sorry that I'm not putting BCs in here. Should have. And he got Judah in 63 BC. And then Augustus at the Battle of Actium conquered the third obstacle for pagan Rome, and then began the 360 years that concludes in 330. Those three conquerings, here, align with the papal conquerings of removing the horn of the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Goths. They were removed in 538. And it's typifying the conquering of the South in 1989, the Soviet Union, the glorious land, and Egypt at the Sunday law in the United States. In pagan Rome's history up here, Pompey conquers two at the beginning, and Augustus conquers one of the three at the end. And in modern Rome's rise, one is conquered at the beginning, the Soviet Union, and then two are conquered at the Sunday law. When the earth beast, the six kingdoms conquered, becomes the head of the seventh kingdom who agree to give their kingdom to the beast. So the two conquerings followed by one in pagan Rome is illustrating a reversal in modern Rome of one conquering in 1989 and then two at the Sunday law. Um, the Edict of Milan, the Sunday Law, Daniel, and the Revelation raised a hand. Go ahead.
Did you say, I just wanted to verify, 65, who conquered in 65? I thought my understanding was is it was Pompey, right?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I
Yeah,
thought you said Nero
Pompey.
for some reason in my head. I heard Nero.
You may have heard that from me. I'm kind of weak-minded
Oh,
today.
that's
This
okay.
is
I just want
Pompey.
to,
I just put
yeah,
it
yeah.
up there.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Um, good, but I just want you to see, I hope that the illustration of pagan Rome's first, and the illustration of modern Rome is last. Papal Rome's in the middle. And
Amen.
pagan Rome in the beginning of the three conquerings, one waymark represents both conquerings, that waymark being Pompeii. And the third conquering is Augustus, whereas with modern Rome, which is the Omega, is the third, if pagan Rome is the Alpha and the first.
Hmm.
And modern Rome's conquering is one at the beginning in 1989, and then the Glorious Land and Egypt at the Sunday Law and the Threefold Union just ahead. So to Nero now, uh, over here on the center on the right. You already got to raise hand again. Go for it.
No, I thought I was putting it down. I thought, sorry.
Okay. No sweat. Dave, I don't know if everyone else is getting this point that I've been making all along that I think is valid and it works, is that we understand when we talk about it as Seventh-day Adventists, we identify Constantine's Sunday law as the first Sunday law. And but you never ever thought you were going to have to use it in a prophetic structure where it's the first Sunday law that's illustrating the last Sunday law. But that's going on here because these three waymarks, the edict, there's a quote where Sister White says, and this is a bad paraphrase, any movement in favor of religious, you know, legislation is a step towards conformity to Rome. Okay, so something like that. But it is. Then an edict it is what she starts with when she says, if the in Great Controversy, if the reader would understand how the soon coming Sunday law, that's me, how the Sunday law comes in, but has to understand the history of the early church. And then when she starts laying out the history, she says edicts, first thing, 313. And then she tells the history that leads to 321. But an edict is a decree, is the Sunday law. They're the same symbols. So when you have an edict in 313, that is a marriage of Constantine and Lepidus, or whatever his name was, Lycisius, the East and the West get married in 313, but they get divorced in 330. Then it's confirming that the first is the last, the Alpha and Omega. 313 is the Alpha, 330 is the Omega. So they have interchangeable characteristics. So whatever's going on at 313, it's also an edict. And the Sunday Law Decree is a type of edict. So all of these are Sunday laws, just like all of the four Roman rulers represent Sunday laws. Tiberius is at the cross. Augustus does the threefold union. Julius does the first threefold union, and he dies with 23 wounds. And Pompey conquers Judea. So the idea that all of these are Sunday law symbols may may seem to some like you're watering it down, but it's not. It's not. It's giving an important distinction. It's saying that 321 is the first Sunday law in relation to the last. Okay, and the first Sunday law is the one that begins a series of Sunday laws that leads to the Sunday law. It's a giant step forward in terms of heading towards the Sunday law that fulfills Bible prophecy. So, bottom of the line, bottom of the screen here, the earth beast is the USA, the sea is the world. This is the image of the beast test in the earth. in the USA. This is the image of the beast test in the world. But it's illustrated by this three steps that are established by Constantine's line. And the 313 will be an edict in the United States, followed by the first Sunday law that ends with the Sunday law that fulfills Bible prophecy. But the first Sunday law for the world is going to be over here at the beginning, and 313 is going to be at the beginning, and it's pushing back here to 313 as well. And what I'm seeing in this crossover, or however you play it, however you lay this over, if you're going to put the amount of weight that I'm putting on the fact that 321 is the first Sunday law, and I'm certain that it is, that down here in 330 is the close of probation for the world, and at the Sunday law, it's the close of probation for the USA, and the decree at the Sunday law, not the edict at the Sunday law, and the first Sunday law thereafter has to do with the work of the United States in Revelation 13, that after it speaks as a dragon in verse 11, then in verse 13 and 14, it's going to go force the world through bringing fire down out of heaven to set up an image of the beast. It's going to set up a church-state relationship, and then it's going to have the power to command that beast to speak. So there's two steps that we've always identified in there, and I'm suggesting those two steps here at the crossover from the earth to the sea are those very two steps represented in the year 313 and the year 321. Okay, 9/11, the judgment of the living begins. The decree there was, of course, the Patriot Act. And at that point, the judgment of the living for the Democrats began, because the judgment of the living was going to impact the Republican horn. Where to put this? The Republican horn. And it was also going to impact the Protestant horn. So from 9/11, the judgment of the living began, and from 9/11 to 2020, the Democrats' judgment of the living took place, and they've come crashing down. In fulfillment of the rules of Bible prophecy is that as Trump is setting up an image of the beast, in Bible prophecy, the dragon is given to the image, and it's the dragon in 2020 from Sodom and Egypt that slew Trump in 2020. And it was the theology of the dragon that slew this movement in 2020. So the dragon and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they come to their end of their judgment time in 2020. And from 2020 to the Sunday law, the Republicans and the virgins are now in the judgment of the living. So when we look at it from that context, 2020 up here, if we bring it down here to 313, 321, and 330, we're seeing that this is a fractal of this history up here where it says virgins. The history that says virgins right here is this history. It's blown up, and I'm placing over the top of it the image of the beast testing time as represented by Constantine in the Edict of Milan for Sunday Law, Division of the Kingdom. So I'm saying that Panium up here at the Sunday law here, that Panium begins before the Sunday law, but it goes straight on through, and at the Sunday law, it becomes Actium. Because it's represented this way, marked by 330, it identifies in history the division of the Roman Empire into East and West. And I'm saying in this sense, the division isn't the Roman Empire, it's the division of the judgment of the living. That from 9/11 to the Sunday law, the judgment of the living has taken place upon God's church, the Protestant horn, but also upon the Republican horn. And when you get the Sunday law, it's all over for the United States as a government and for the Protestant and Republican horn. They've closed their probation one way or the other, lost or saved. And it transcends then to the East, the world. I'm saying the East is the sea, it's the world, the West is the earth. And the healing of the deadly wound that takes place at the Sunday law here, that takes place when Augustus Caesar defeats Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. So this Battle of Panium and this Battle of Actium, they come together. Clayton, when he was reading from this guy, this Perkins guy, William Perkins from the 16th century, he says he went through every verse we went through to show the distinction between inclusive and exclusive numbering. So any way you want to do this, if you want to say that you want to use exclusive reckoning, you'd say, well, Panium stops the day before the Sunday law and Actium starts the day after the Sunday law. If you're going to say inclusive, then they just run into each other. And the obvious choice on this one is they run into each other. This is the Third World War that begins just before the Sunday law and continues until human probation closes. And there is a marriage that takes place in 313 and a divorce in 330. And I'm suggesting that it parallels the history of the parable of the 10 virgins because there is a marriage that is taking place from 2020 onward until the 144,000 are sealed and lifted up and separated from the tares, and the 11th hour workers are called to come and stand with them. Okay. Now, does everyone remember Leviticus 23? So this is what blows my mind for me. I don't know about you, but it blows my mind. Is it these lines of prophecy all by themselves, just alone, they're profound. They take two or three of them together and it just dazzles you. And then you reach out and there's another one doing the same thing. But they're connecting. They're all connecting now. That's where it gets unreal. So anyway, Leviticus 23. I know that some people, if they've thought it through, they question my justification for saying that this Sabbath over here up in the right-hand corner is the Sabbath of the land. I get it. It's not so directly laid out in Leviticus 23, and that this is the seventh day Sabbath, seventh year Sabbath is what I should have put year. But that's the bookends on Leviticus 23. And this is a look into the Ark of the Covenant is what it is a look into. And those two Sabbaths are the covering cherubs. And you have a 3-1 combination at the beginning. You have this one-way mark made up of 3-way marks: death, burial, resurrection. And in the burial, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread that shoots out over here for to mark off this 5-day period after the Feast of First Fruits. Then you have 30 days. This is the final preparation for the priests. And the priests, there's lots of 30s in there. From 1989 to the Sunday Law is 30, based on Daniel 12:11. From 1996 to 2026 is 30 years. And in 1996, the message was formalized, pointing forward to the work of formalizing the message this year. And here we have 30 years, and this 30 years, it's running parallel to the 40 days that Christ was witnessing during the Pentecostal season after his resurrection. So this is face-to-face instruction, and face-to-face instruction to me takes you to Daniel chapter 10, right? To the vision of the temple, to the second test, the temple test, to see Christ as the Mara vision. So anyway, this is Leviticus 23. The structure here is the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and in the middle of the Day of Atonement and Feast of Trumpets, you have this ascension at the end of 40 days. I have them out of order, didn't think about it. But you have, again, a 3-1 combination at the end of this history that takes you to Pentecost, the Sunday Law, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Holy Spirit is poured out without measure upon a church that has made itself ready. So when we bring the image of the beast line as represented by Constantine, the Sunday Law, Pentecost, if you're just looking at the United States, it's the close of probation, it's the division of the East and the West. It's 330, it's right here. Okay, so that one's fairly straightforward. But this one here would be the very first Sunday Law, when the Sunday Law started in the United States, 321. And there would be an edict over here. Okay, an edict that would start this process. So dropping down here, I want to say something about this before. I'm sorry, I wanted to say this and I forgot it. The Sabbath of the land, all right, resting a year instead of a day, it's the 2520. And this is the 2300. And there is no direct "thus saith the Lord's" for these, okay? But I contend it's like the Christ coming down in Revelation 18, having a book in his hand that you don't see, but you know it's there. Okay, why do you know it's there? Well, I understand it's there because William Miller tells us that the very first prophetic discovery he made was over here, the 2520. And in the same comment, he says, then I found the 2300. Okay, and the 2520 that is the alpha of his discoveries, it represents 1798. Now, I know it came to a conclusion, the other one in 1844, but this one's 1798, and this one's 1844. So when you look into the ark, okay, in 1844, when Ellen White, by faith in vision, went into the most holy place, she's seen the seventh-day Sabbath lightened above the other commandments, which were lightened up as well. But then as she describes the last days, that the students of prophecy that are following on to know the Lord recognize that the doctrine of the incarnation is invested with a soft halo or a holy glow. It's the omega of the alpha. The seventh day Sabbath is the alpha Sabbath. And the seventh year Sabbath is the omega Sabbath. And I'm saying when you go into the most holy place in this temple test that we're now in, which involves understanding that the Pope and the President were standing in the Holy Land in 2025. That's part of it. The temple test has an external element, and you fail, you're not even involved with that test if you don't understand that it's Rome that establishes the vision. And that argument goes back to the foundations of the Millerites, as does the 2520 and the 2300. Okay, so you're in the temple test, and when you look in there, you have to accept all the accumulated light of the past ages. So you're going to look in there like Sister White, and you're going to see the seventh-day Sabbath glowing, but you're also going to see the doctrine of the incarnation. And I'm saying the doctrine of the incarnation is the 2520. Okay, and why is it the 2520? Because it's the doctrine of one line of 2520 reaching 1798 that was the lower nature in the flesh, and it can't be redeemed. It has to wait to the second coming and be replaced with a glorified body. And the incarnation is the work or the act of Christ in joining his divinity with our humanity. And that joining takes place in the most holy place, and it takes place with the 2520 that extends all the way to 1844, along with the 2300 years that extend to 1844. And the 2520 that extends to 1844 is the higher nature. It's what can be changed in a moment. You can be given the mind of Christ. So when I'm saying the 2520 is the doctrine of the incarnation, Christ set an example that his divinity combined with our humanity does not sin. And he set that example in his incarnation. And his incarnation in man is represented in the light of the 2520. And his work of creation and redemption is represented in the light of the seventh-day Sabbath. And it's the seal, and it's the sign. And when you look into the Ark of the Covenant, you see that light. But what you also see, if you're willing to see, is that there are two great errors by which Rome will take the world captive. One is an error in regard to the seventh-day Sabbath, and the other is an error in regard to the incarnation, okay, in regard to the nature of man. The first lie is to believe that man shall not die, and it produces spiritualism. And by these two great errors, spiritualism, the immortality of the soul, and Sunday sacredness, Rome is going to take the world captive. And I'm saying those two great errors are the counterfeit arguments to the seventh-day Sabbath and the doctrine of the incarnation. And I'm saying that seventh-day Sabbath is represented by the 2300 years, and that the doctrine of the incarnation is represented by the 2520 years, and that this temple test opens light not only to the experience that we must gain at this point in time, but also light in regards to the attack that is carried out against these two truths. So, the litmus test of this history where it all comes to pass, whether you've got the oil or not, is at the Feast of Trumpets. And the trumpets are the Jubilee trumpet down here and the seventh trumpet, which is the third woe. And the Jubilee trumpet, which is associated with the 2520, was to be sounded on the Day of Atonement. And when the Day of Atonement trumpet began to sound on October 22nd, 1844, that trumpet was the seventh trumpet, and it was also the third woe. So at the Feast of Trumpets, which I'm suggesting is the Edict of Milan. Both trumpets are going to be blown, one about the 2300, one about the 2520. It's going to be a warning against the first day of the week. It's going to be a warning against spiritualism. It represents the seal that's going to be placed upon God's people and the experience that God's people are going to have. And if you get to the Feast of Trumpets, to the Edict of Milan, I'm suggesting that it's too late. And I know it's probably difficult to see, but over here in this quote, it's from Early Writings, page 68, over here. You can't see it, I'll read it for you. It says, those who would not receive the mark of the beast and his image when the decree goes forth must have decision now to say, nay, we will not regard the institution of the beast. This is illustrated by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they're saying to Nebuchadnezzar, you don't need to ask us. We're not going to bow down. We decided what we were going to do a long time ago. And now this is where to me, the message starts getting a little bit serious. 330 is a Sunday law. It's either the Sunday law in the United States, or it's the last Sunday law when human probation closes, but it's a Sunday law. And it's the last Sunday law in relation to the first Sunday law, which is 321. And 313 is an edict. And I know that in history, it was an edict that was understood as religious freedom, but it's reversed. It's the first edict in the implementation of the image of the beast, the setting up of the image, and it's a Sunday law as well. They're all Sunday laws. My point is, when you get to the edict, the first of these three Sunday laws that leads to the close of probation for this nation, you already have to be settled into the truth so you won't be moved. Those who would not receive the mark of the beast and image when the decree goes forth must have decision now to say nay. Okay, so you could argue the decree goes forth over here at the Sunday law in 330, and I'd say, well, no, the decree is in 321, but no, it's over here at 313. We must be sealed before over here. We have to have a decision right there to say nay. It's the last opportunity. Okay, so the Edict of Milan, there was a marriage that took place, and there was a divorce that took place in 330. And I'm saying before you get to the Edict of Milan, the bride has to make herself ready. And in chapter 22, the bride makes herself ready when the windows of heaven are opened. And the windows of heaven are opened in Malachi 3. And the windows of heaven are opened in Miller's dream. Just before the Edict of Milan, before the final perfect fulfillment of the setting up of the image of the beast, the bride has to be ready. And when she's ready, then the marriage begins, okay? The marriage that's going to culminate over here at the Sunday law that is parallel in this counterfeit marriage and divorce up above. All right. Now, how can I say that 2025, how can I make the claims about 2025 that I'm making? Well, this is how I think I can do it. All right. In verse 10, you have Reagan and John Paul II. And in verse 11, you have Obama. And that's 2014, okay? Because we're marking Raffia as 2014. That's verse 11. And Obama is the president in 2014. In 2013, I think it's March 13th or May 13th. It's a month that begins with an M. let's say March 13th, 2013, you have two 13s in there. It's doubled because Obama, in relation to Reagan and Trump, is the second angel's message. Reagan is the first, Trump is the third. So there's going to be a doubling, and this is why you have so many doublings about Obama. Is he gay or is he straight? Is he Kenyan or is he American? On and on. It the in his history, when the one pope retired, something they very rarely ever do, and the other one joined on May 13th, 2013, the one that retired had formerly for 24 years been the head of the office of the Inquisition, and the one that took over was the first Jesuit pope. Okay, if you aren't seeing the doubling in here, you need to, because this structure is part of the argument about why I can say Trump and Leo in 2025 is representing a sign, right? It's the sign of the open relationship. It's the sign of the abomination of desolation, okay, which comes just before the siege. And the siege, um, it'll hit and you'll have last moment to escape, but we shouldn't be living in the cities now anyway. Okay, so over here, 2025 on the bottom left-hand corner, I'm saying this will be a wedding announcement for the unholy marriage that's going to begin in 313. And it's going to be divorced in 330, but it's at the same time the marriage of the threefold union takes place there. So my argument is this, is that before I move away from this verse 15, this is Augustus Caesar. Verse 11 is Julius Caesar. And this is Pompey. So I'm only putting them up there to add to the evidence that this three-step sequence is correct, okay? Reagan is the first, Trump is the last. But when Reagan is in association with the Pope, and that's what Revelation 13 is all about, the United States placing the Pope on the throne of the earth. When Reagan is in relationship with the Pope, he's illustrating a relationship of Obama in the history of verse 11 of Daniel 11, which is Raphia, and Obama's the one with the double popes. He's the second angel. And therefore, Leo and Trump, they have to represent something. And what they represent is that they're both inaugurated in the same year. And their inauguration, it has to do with setting up this unholy temple that the Pope of Rome is seated in, telling himself he's God at the Sunday law. Okay, it's the process of the marriage. It's the process of anointing a temple. All right, for Roman rulers. I see we only have 2 more slides after this, so patience. We'll work through it. This is the 4 Roman rulers, Daniel 11:16 through 24. Pompey was a general. Julius, Augustus, and Tiberius, they were all Caesars. So there's truce connected with these Roman figures that can be isolated and teach things. And I've been doing that today already, and you just need to be aware of that symbols can have more than one meaning. Verse 10 is the end of the Fourth Syrian War. Julius is Raphia, Augustus is Panium. Okay, so Pompey, he takes out the first 2 obstacles for Rome in 65 BC, 63 BC, and then Augustus takes it out in 31 BC. So Julius to Augustus over here, this line. This is the first triumvirate and the second triumvirate. Julius is a threefold union. Augustus is a threefold union. Julius wasn't official. Augustus was. This is the setting up of the image of the beast. It's the first Sunday law, because at the Sunday law, the threefold union takes place. As the first Sunday law, it would line up with 321. And Augustus would, at the threefold union, would line up with 330. Down here, on lower left-hand corner, Mark Antony and Julius together. They're with Cleopatra. They were both with Cleopatra. So they're given two witnesses to the same thing. Cleopatra was of Greek lineage ruling in Egypt. So she's a double dragon power. And Julius and Mark Antony, doesn't matter. They were both from Rome. So in that relationship, just in that relationship of Mark Antony or Julius being a lover with Cleopatra, then it's Rome in connection with Greece and Egypt, or it's simply the beast with the dragon, or the north with the south, or at another level, it's statecraft with churchcraft, because Cleopatra's a woman, and she's a woman that prophetically, she gets set aside twice. Julius is going to leave her, and then Mark Antony and her are going to die together. So Julius Caesar is 1798 in verse 40. That's the deadly wound. He just left Cleopatra. And when she comes to her end with none to help in verse 45, at the end of verses 40 to 45, she comes to her end. Just as she came to her end in 1798. Then when she comes to her end in verse 45, it's with Mark Antony. And Mark Antony and she both go down at the same time at the Battle of Actium, that's accomplished by Augustus Caesar over here in the right-hand corner. And I'm afraid I might lose you here. I don't mean to. The symbols we were using down over here in this corner are all sound, but now I'm going to relate to some of the same symbols differently. At the Battle of Actium, Augustus Caesar is going to defeat Cleopatra and Mark Antony. In this relationship, Augustus is the beast, because at the Battle of Actium, which is the Sunday law, the 10 kings are going to agree to lift up one head. And Sister White says, under one head, the papal power. Okay, and the papal power is the beast. Cleopatra is the dragon. She's the spiritualism of the dragon. And Mark Antony is the false prophet. He is a relative of Rome, a prophet of Baal for Jezebel up here. I guess this would be Jezebel. So one more slide. Lining some things up now. Nero, I hope you get it. This is the end of his 250 years, right here. Whereas the end for Antiochus is at the middle way mark. And the end for Trump or the United States, however you phrase that, is at a middle way mark. It's at the midpoint, the midterm elections. In 313, up here at the top, you have a marriage. And the marriage in the parable of the 10 virgins is fulfilled by Millerites and by the 144,000. It's at the first disappointment. Okay, because the disappointment is the tarrying time. It begins the tarrying time, and at the end of the tarrying time, then you're at the midnight cry of Exeter camp meeting. And over here in 1844 is the marriage, which is typified by the divorce in the line of Nero. But This is the marriage. And for us, our first disappointment is July 18th, 2020. And our Exeter camp meeting begins December 31st, 2023, and it carries on for several days. And the foundational test concludes in 2025, and the temple test, the capstone test, begins, heading to the Sunday law. All right. I'm weary right now, so I'm having to think through these slides to even remember. Oh, here's the 30 years one. Okay, 1989 unto the Sunday law is 30 years according to Daniel 12:11, which is the middle of those three verses in Daniel chapter 12, where we have the illustration of what happens when the book of Daniel is unsealed. And there's a three-step testing process where many are purified, made white, and tried. In Daniel 12, the middle verse, 7, identifies December 31st, 2023. 12:12 of Daniel identifies July 18th of 2020. But verse 11 identifies 30 years followed by 1260 years. And the 1260 years is a papal rule. It's the 42 months of Revelation 13. They're symbolic months. It's the second papal bloodbath. And together they make up the 1290 years of Daniel 12:11. But the 30 years begins at 1989. It's speaking about developing the priests. From 1996, when the message is formalized, until 2026 is 30 years. From 9/11 until 2023, when the book is unsealed, is 22 years, which is the same 22 years, not the same, it's parallel to the 22 years from 1776 to 1798. And because of that, and because it's the end of the 3.5 days in Revelation 11, it marks the unsealing of the revelation of Jesus Christ that took place at that time. And in that unsealing, we're now at the point to where we can see that in here is 30 days of Leviticus 23. So these 30 days, this is a symbol of God's people. It's the 300 Millerite preachers. It's the 300 that were with Gideon. It's the age of the priests. It's the story of the priesthood that is raised up as an ensign at the soon coming Sunday law. Okay, the testing process down here at this line here that we're in now. We've talked about 457 begins with 3 decrees down here, left-hand corner. The 2300 begins. And that's the internal. The 250 begins. And that's the external. And they're both telling about a change of dispensation at beginning and ending. Then the 3 angels' messages in fulfillment of the 3 decrees come into history in 1798, 1844, and 1844. Those 3 decrees and those 3 angels' messages are representing 3 steps at the end that lead to the Sunday law. 1844 is the Sunday law, but 1844 is also 330. And 321 would be the first Sunday law. And in that regard, second step, and the decree would be the beginning of the image of the beast testing time. So what takes us to 1844, whether it's the literal year 1844 or the Sunday law, are three steps. Every time begins with three steps, ends with three steps. This is Daniel 9:24 and 25. 70 weeks are determined, close of probation. Patriot 9/11 is the Patriot Act. It's 1888. It's the Blair Bills. It's the Edict of Milan. It's the image of the beast testing time. All right. I've spoke my piece of my